Michael is 45. For 7 years, he has organized his mornings around a protocol of formidable precision. He wakes without an alarm at 5:15. He meditates for 20 minutes, not 19. He follows an eating window, tracks his macronutrients, and has not consumed alcohol in 4 years. His sleep is measured by a device on his wrist, assessed each morning and used to adjust the day's activity load. He speaks about the protocol with the fluency of someone who has read everything published on the subject and retained most of it. His colleagues regard him with a mixture of admiration and mild discomfort. His partner of 8 years has described the protocol as the third person in their relationship. Michael regards this observation as a misunderstanding of what he is doing. He is optimizing. He is, in his own account, taking his health seriously in a way most people do not have the discipline to sustain. Last month, with no obvious external trigger, Michael stopped. Not scaled back, stopped. The meditations, the dietary restrictions, the sleep tracking, the deliberate cold exposure, the abstinence from alcohol. He began drinking again. He stayed up until 2 in the morning watching things he would not have previously approved. He ate without tracking. He has not resumed any part of the protocol in 30 days. He is not depressed. He is not in crisis in any measurable clinical sense. He cannot explain what happened, and the inability to explain it bothers him more than the behavior itself. A person who has organized 7 years around rational control of the body does not easily tolerate the discovery that something in the psyche has, apparently, other plans. What happened to Michael was not a failure of discipline. It was something much older, much more impersonal, and much more informative. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. The concept of Enantiodromia does not originate with Jung. It originates with Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher who observed, approximately 25 centuries ago, that opposites generate each other, that the cold warms and the warm cools, that the sleeper wakes and the waking sleeps, that everything, carried to its extreme, produces its contrary. The Greek word, roughly, translates as running in the opposite direction. Jung encountered Heraclitus's fragments and recognized in them a precise description of something he was observing in clinical work, the pattern in which an extreme attitude in the psyche eventually, inevitably, produces its opposite. Not as a moral lesson, not as punishment, as a structural feature of psychic life. In Volume 6 of the collected works, Psychological Types, Jung defined the principle directly. Enantiodromia names the moment when extreme one-sidedness in the psyche gives rise to its opposite. The pendulum analogy is tempting but imprecise. It implies regularity, predictability, gentle oscillation. The psychic version is less mechanical and more eruptive. It does not oscillate. It suppresses and suppresses and suppresses, and then it reverses with a force proportional to the duration and severity of the suppression. The reason this matters clinically is that the reversal is not experienced as resolution. It is experienced as failure, as collapse, as the arrival of exactly what the person was working hardest to prevent. Michael spent 7 years constructing a system designed to optimize his physical and psychological functioning. The system worked, by its own metrics, with remarkable consistency. And then it stopped, not because Michael chose to stop it, but because something beneath the level of the system's control had accumulated enough counterpressure to override it. What Jung added to Heraclitus's observation was the psychological mechanism. The unconscious, in Jung's framework, functions as a self-regulating system. It does not simply absorb what the ego suppresses. It stores it, and it builds pressure around it. The more completely and consistently one pole of a psychological duality is suppressed, the more charged the suppressed pole becomes. The energy does not dissipate. It inverts. In Volume 8 of the collected works, in his writing on the nature of psychic energy, Jung described the tension of opposites as the primary source of what he called psychic energy, the equivalent, in the psychological domain, of the potential energy that exists between two opposite poles. This is not a metaphor he uses loosely. The psychic energy that drives human motivation, creativity, and change, in Jung's model, is generated precisely by the opposition between conscious attitude and unconscious complement. The most energetic systems are the most polarized ones. and the most polarized systems are the most vulnerable to enantiodromia. To understand what happened to Michael, it is necessary to understand what his protocol was actually doing at the psychological level, not at the physiological level, where it was functioning reasonably well, but in the broader psychic economy. Michael's protocol was not simply a health practice. It was, in Jungian terms, an exercise in ego control over the instinctual life. The body, its hungers, its resting states, its desires for food and sleep, and the abandonment of structure, represents, in Jung's framework, one of the primary channels through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness. The body has its own logic, its own timing, its own insistence on being attended to on terms other than the ego's. The wellness protocol, in its extreme form, was not attending to the body. It was managing it, overriding it, running it according to a system derived from external metrics rather than internal states. This is a distinction that wellness culture as a phenomenon consistently collapses. The language of optimization, of protocols, of biohacking assumes that the body is a system whose performance can be indefinitely improved by the application of better inputs and rules. The Jungian perspective does not dispute that certain inputs are better than others for physical functioning. It disputes the framing of the body as a system to be managed rather than a voice to be listened to. These are different relationships to the same organism, and they produce different psychological consequences. Michael's protocol was, in this reading, an ego project, ambitious, disciplined, and organized around a particular form of control. What it suppressed was considerable: the desire for pleasure without justification, the impulse toward rest that was not optimized sleep, the social dimension of eating and drinking that exists entirely outside the tracked macronutrient register. The experience of the body is something that has its own wisdom rather than as a system requiring external governance. None of these suppressed dimensions disappeared. They went underground, in the Jungian sense, into the unconscious, where they continued to accumulate charge. For 7 years. The question that is almost never asked about the extreme wellness practitioner, and this is the question that differentiates depth psychological analysis from motivational commentary, is not how they stay disciplined, but what they are afraid of. What is the unconscious that the protocol is organized to hold at bay? What is the experience that optimal sleep and tracked macronutrients are keeping at a sufficient distance that the person can function without encountering it? For Michael, the answer to this question is not available in this script, because it would be specific to Michael's particular psychology, his particular developmental history, his particular shadow. But the structure of the question is generalizable. Any extreme attitude in the psyche is not only what it claims to be. It is also a defense against its opposite. The more total the defense, the more energetically charged the thing being defended against. When Michael stopped, he did not make a decision. Something in him stopped. The Enantiodromia did not arrive as a choice. It arrived as an eruption, sudden, total, and organized around the precise opposite of everything the protocol had stood for. Alcohol, which he had not touched in 4 years, represents exactly what the protocol excluded: the abandonment of control, the body doing what it wants without being managed, the blurring of the crisp edges the protocol maintained. The unconscious, when it finally overrode the system, did not produce a moderate revision of the protocol. It produced its exact opposite. This is what distinguishes enantiodromia from ordinary behavioral change. Ordinary change is partial, negotiated, maintained by the same ego that made the original decision. Enantiodromia is total, sudden, and not authored by the ego at all. The person experiencing it typically describes it as something that happened to them, not something they chose. Michael's inability to explain it is not a failure of self-awareness. It is an accurate report. The part of him that ended the protocol was not the part that built it. What does this mean practically? Not as a prescription, but as a structural understanding. The antidote to enantiodromia is not, as it might seem, a more moderate protocol. It is a fundamental shift in the relationship between the ego and the opposite. Not an elimination of discipline, but a genuine encounter with what the discipline has been excluding, an attentiveness to the body not as a system to be optimized, but as a presence that has something to communicate. This encounter is not comfortable. What has been suppressed for 7 years does not present itself gently, when it is finally admitted. But the encounter is the only thing that prevents the cycle from simply restarting. The protocol rebuilt, the suppression resumed, the next enantiodromia accumulating. Return to Michael. He is 30 days into the collapse of the protocol. He is drinking again, staying up late, eating without metrics. He is not happy. He is not, in fact, experiencing the relief one might expect from the removal of a demanding regime. He is experiencing something closer to a loss of orientation, the absence of the structure that, whatever else it was, organized his days with coherence. This is a specific feature of enantiodromia that is worth dwelling on. The reversal does not deliver the opposite of the suppressed experience in any form that is satisfying. Michael did not suppress pleasure for 7 years and then suddenly access genuine pleasure when the protocol collapsed. What arrived was the opposite of control, which is not pleasure, but its rough approximation. The uninhibited indulgence that contains no more genuine meeting of need than the protocol that preceded it. He has gone from one extreme to the other, and neither extreme is the place he was actually trying to reach. This is the psychological law at work. The enantiodromia does not solve the problem the extreme attitude was organized around. It simply demonstrates the problem's other face. Michael built the protocol in response to something, some experience of disorder, or vulnerability, or uncontrollability that the optimized system was designed to address. The protocol did not address that experience. It managed it, and the collapse of the protocol has not addressed it either. It has simply removed the management and left the original experience exposed. What the Jungian framework would suggest is that the more important question, more important than how to rebuild the protocol or how to find a moderate version of it, is what the protocol was being used to not experience. What was the disorder, the vulnerability, the instinctual life that needed 7 years of systematic suppression? That question is not comfortable. It is also not answerable through optimization. It requires a different quality of attention, the kind that moves toward what the ego has been organizing to avoid. Michael is a person of significant intelligence and discipline. He has demonstrated, thoroughly, that he can apply those qualities to the external management of his body. What the enantiodromia is, in Jungian terms, is an invitation, not a gentle one, to apply some of that same intelligence to the interior life the protocol was managing on behalf of, not to replace the protocol with another system, to ask what the system was for. One might ask, without judgment, whether any area of one's own life is organized around an extreme that feels like virtue, not an extreme that is recognized as such from the outside. Extreme attitudes rarely are, from the inside, but an area where deviation from a certain standard produces a disproportionate anxiety or a quality of collapse rather than simple adjustment. That disproportionality is often the indicator of suppression in Heraclitus's and Jung's sense. Where the anxiety of deviation is very high, the charge accumulating beneath the surface is correspondingly high. One might also consider whether the practices one has adopted in the name of health, physical, psychological, or otherwise, attend to the body and the unconscious as sources of information, or manage them as systems to be controlled. This is not a binary. Most practices do some of both. The question is about the dominant orientation, and about whether the interior life has a channel through which it can communicate something other than what the system has already decided it should communicate. The broader cultural observation, and it is an observation rather than a critique, because the phenomenon is genuinely complex, is that contemporary wellness culture has developed an extraordinary sophistication in the domain of optimization while remaining almost entirely silent about the psychological dynamics that drive the optimizing impulse itself. The literature on circadian rhythms, nutritional timing, recovery protocols, and cognitive performance is extensive and in many respects genuinely valuable. The literature on what it means when someone needs to optimize in an extreme and totalizing way, on what the optimization is organized to manage, is essentially absent from the mainstream. Jung's insight, derived from Heraclitus, is that any human system organized around the suppression of one pole of a psychological duality will, over time, produce that pole with a force proportional to the suppression. This is not pessimism about the possibility of structure or discipline. It is a description of the conditions under which structure and discipline remain viable rather than becoming their own undoing. The key condition is not moderation as an external standard, eat moderately, sleep moderately, but something more fundamental, an ongoing relationship with what the structure is excluding, an attentiveness to what is being suppressed, and a genuine willingness to allow some of what is suppressed to be present without being immediately managed back into order. Michael's collapse is not a failure. It is the psyche demonstrating, with considerable clarity, that the system it was running had reached its limit, that the suppressed opposite had accumulated enough charge to override the ego's management. That demonstration is uncomfortable. It is also, from a Jungian perspective, the most useful piece of information Michael's psychology has produced in 7 years. The question is whether he will treat it as information or simply as a problem to be solved by rebuilding the protocol better. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. If the concept of Enantiodromia suggests something relevant to your own experience of discipline, collapse, or the recurring pattern of extremes, those questions are a place to begin. Subscribe if you want to continue this examination.